In the previous lesson, we said that the main direction of human history since the agricultural revolution is towards unity. At the time of the agricultural revolution, the world was divided into thousands of separate human societies, each of which was very small and relatively simple. As time went by, small and simple societies combined to form larger and more complex societies until, in the modern era, the entire world became a single global system. This unification of humankind was driven forward by three main forces: by money, by empires, and by religions. In the previous lesson, we examined the role of money and of trade in the unification of humankind. In the next lesson, we'll discuss religion. In this lesson, I would like to focus on the part played by conquerors and empires in uniting the whole world. I would like to begin this lesson by explaining what an empire is. So, an empire is a political order which has two very important characteristics. First of all, in order to be considered an empire, you must rule over a significant number of distinct peoples, each of which possess a different cultural identity and a separate territory. How many different people do you need to rule to be an empire? So there is no exact number. If you rule just 2 or 3 different peoples, you're not an empire. If you rule 30 or 40, then yes, you are an empire. Somewhere in between say 3 and 20, 30, passes the imperial threshold of how many people you need to control to be an empire. So this is the first characteristic of empire. Empires rule over a lot of different peoples. The second characteristic of empire is that it has flexible borders and a potentially unlimited territorial appetite. Empires are systems of government that can swallow and digest more and more nations and territories without altering their basic structure or their basic identity. Take, say, modern Canada of today. Canada is a very, very big country. However, it is not an empire. One of the main reasons why Canada is not an empire is that it cannot annex more and more territories to itself without changing its most fundamental structure. If Canada would start conquering and annexing, say, Cuba and Venezuela and Mexico and so forth to itself, it would no longer be itself. It would be something completely different. An empire, on the other hand, is a kind of political system that can conquer almost any place on earth without changing its basic nature and characteristics. So we see that empires are culturally diverse, they rule over many peoples, each with its own culture, and they are territorially flexible. They can become bigger and bigger and bigger without changing their basic identity. These two features give empires not only their unique character, but also give them the very central role in history and in the process of human unification. It is thanks to these two characteristics that empires have managed to unite diverse ethnic groups and diverse ecological zones under a single political structure, thereby fusing together larger and larger segments of the human species and contributing to the unification of humankind. It should also be stressed that an empire is defined only by these two characteristics, the cultural diversity and the flexible borders, and not by its form of government. An empire does not need an emperor It does not have to be governed by a single dictator or king. The British Empire, for example, which is the largest empire that ever existed in history, was ruled by a democracy. There are other democratic or at least republican empires in history. For example, in the modern age, you have the Dutch, the French, the Belgian, and the American empires, all ruled by democracies. And in the pre-modern era, you have empires like Rome, Carthage, Athens, and others, which are also governed by a democratic or at least republican elite. So empires are not defined by their system of government itself. Also, empires are not defined by size. Empires can actually be very small. The Athenian Empire, for example, at its height was much smaller in territorial size and population than today's Greece. The Aztec Empire was much smaller than the modern country of Mexico. Both of them, Athens and the Aztecs, are nevertheless considered to be empires, whereas modern Greece and modern Mexico are not considered empires, because whereas the Athenian and the Aztecs ruled dozens, even hundreds of different people, and they could expand indefinitely, there was no limit for the expansion, for the potential expansion of the Aztecs or of the Athenians. Modern Greece and modern Mexico, they rule a much smaller number of different people, and they cannot expand a lot without changing their basic character. Now it might be asked, how was it possible in the time of ancient Athens to squeeze hundreds of different people into a territory that today contains just a small modern state like Greece? How does it make sense to have an entire empire in a territory that today is just considered a small state? It was possible because in the past there are many more different peoples in the world than there are today. And people in the past, centuries and thousands of years ago, each people had a much smaller population and occupied a much smaller piece of ground than the typical people of today. And one of the main reasons for this drastic reduction in human diversity is empires. Empires are responsible for this transition from having a lot of very, very small peoples, each with a tiny territory, to having a much smaller number of different people, each spread over a much bigger territory. What happened is, over the centuries, that you had these empires like steamrollers, which gradually obliterated the unique characteristics of numerous tiny people and forged them together to become much larger groups. Now, when we discuss empires in history, we have to take into account the prejudices of modern culture, of people today. In our time, empires have gotten a very bad reputation, a very bad publicity. Imperialist is one of the worst curses in our political lexicon. If you want to insult somebody, say to insult a political rival or a state with which you have differences, you very often say that they are imperialist. Imperialism is considered a very, very bad thing. Empires are considered very bad. The modern objection to empires commonly takes two forms. First of all, people object to empires because they argue that empires are inefficient, that empires simply don't work. It's very common today to hear that in the long run, it is not possible to rule effectively over a large number of conquered people, that empires are doomed to failure and to collapse. The second main objection to empires is not only that they don't work, but also that they are evil. Even if you can build an empire, you shouldn't do it, because empires are evil and they corrupt both the conquered people, which are not given independence to develop, and also they corrupt the conquerors. It's very common in the last few decades, in the last century, to argue that every people has a right to self-determination, so there should be as many independent states in the world as there are people. No people should be governed by an empire, by somebody else. Now, from a historical perspective, the first statement that empires don't work is simply nonsense. We'll discuss it in a minute. And the second statement, that empires are evil, this is very, very problematic statement. So let's start with the first argument, that empires simply don't work. The truth is that empire has been the world's most common form of political organization for the last 2,500 years. In the last 2.5 millennia, most human beings on Earth have lived in empires, not in independent states. From a macro perspective, empires work much better than independent states. Empires are a very stable, relatively, when compared to other forms of governments, empire is a very stable form of government. Most empires have found it, contrary to what you often hear today, most empires have found it alarmingly easy to put down all the rebellions of the conquered populations, of the conquered people, and to maintain their control of dozens of different people. In general, all empires collapse in the end, but not because of internal revolts by the conquered people. This sometimes happens, but it's quite rare. Most empires have collapsed either because of external invasion of external enemies or of another empire, or because of a split within the ruling elite itself. The elite controlling the empire starts fighting amongst itself, and then the empire collapses, not because the conquered people rose in rebellion. Conversely, the conquered people have a pretty lousy record of managing to free themselves from the ruling empires. Most conquered people in history never freed themselves from the empires that conquered them. Even if they tried to rebel, the empire managed to break the rebellion and continue to control them. And what happened to most conquered people in history, that they remained part of the empire that swallowed them. They were slowly digested within the stomach of the empire, within the empire. They gradually lost their unique identity, their unique culture, and they simply disappeared. And even if eventually the empire collapsed because some external enemy attacked or the ruling elite began to fight amongst itself, when the empire collapsed, the conquered people did not emerge from the stomach of the dead empire like Jonah coming out of the belly of the fish. They simply didn't exist anymore. For example, when the Western Roman Empire fell to the invading Germanic tribes in the 5th century AD, hundreds of tribes and nations whom the Romans conquered centuries earlier did not emerge from the empire's dead body and went on with their existence because they simply didn't exist any longer. They were now Romans, all kinds of distinct people conquered by the Romans, say in the 1st century BC. When the empire finally collapsed, the people did not become free because they were now Romans. Their unique identity disappeared. In many cases, perhaps even in most cases, the destruction of one empire simply resulted in the formation of a new empire. Nowhere can we see this process more clearly than in the history of the Middle East, the place where the first empires arose more than 3,000, 4,000 years ago. The current political situation in the Middle East, when we have a sort of balance of power between many independent political entities with more or less stable borders, different states, this situation is almost without parallel any time in the history of the Middle East for the last several thousands of years. The last time the Middle East was experienced such a situation of being divided into many relatively stable different states was in the 8th century BC, almost 3,000 years ago. From the rise of the Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BC, when it conquered all these different states of the Middle East, until the collapse of the British and French empires in the middle of the 20th century, the Middle East, the people of the Middle East passed from the hands of one empire into the hands of another empire like a stick in a relay race. When the runners pass the stick from one to the other, this is what happened to the people of the Middle East. They were conquered by the Assyrians, but when the Assyrian Empire collapsed, they didn't regain their independence. You now had the Babylonian Empire, and then the Persian Empire, and then King Alexander the Great, and the Romans, and the Byzantines, and the Arabs, and so forth. You almost never had a situation when you had no empire in the Middle East, and the local people simply managed their affairs by themselves. Hence, it's simply a mistake to think that empires do not work. Most people for the last 2,000 years lived in empires, and yes, empires eventually collapse, but in most places they were replaced by other empires, not by a different kind of political order. Now, what about the second argument against empires, that empires are evil? Well, it is certainly true that building and maintaining an empire usually required slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people and brutally oppressing millions of more people. The standard imperial toolkit, the toolkit with which you build and maintain an empire, it includes war, it includes enslavement, deportation, and genocide, the extermination of entire population. This does not mean, however, that empires are pure evil and that they leave nothing good, nothing of value in their wake. If you color all the empires in history as black, and if you renounce all the imperial legacies from culture, then you will find that you basically colored black almost all of human culture, and that you have rejected at least very significant parts of it. Because much of human culture, at least over the last two and a half millennia, have been the product of empires. Imperial elites used the profits of conquest not only in order to finance armies and fortifications and things like that, they also used the profits of conquest and empire to finance most of human philosophy, art, and also to finance justice and law and charity and things like that. A huge part of the artistic masterpieces of humankind owe their existence to empires and to the exploitation of conquered populations. The profits and prosperity of the Athenian Empire and of the Roman Empire is what provided the philosophers of old, all these Socrates and Plato and Cicero and Seneca and all these, the profits of empire provided them with the ability, with the leisure time to not work and just think about the world and write their masterpieces. Similarly, in architecture, let's take the Taj Mahal as an example. The Taj Mahal could not have been built without the wealth that was accumulated by the Mughal emperors from exploiting millions of their Indian subjects. Similarly, in music. If you think about the music of Haydn or Mozart, you couldn't finance, or at least the music of Haydn and Mozart, it was financed by the profits of the Habsburg Empire from exploiting its Slavic and Romanian-speaking and Hungarian subject people. Even if we leave aside all these fields of high culture, like classical music and architecture and philosophy, and focus on the culture, on the world of the common people, there too, we will find that imperial legacies influence the majority of the cultures today in the world. And this is most obvious in the field of language. What kind of languages people use to speak and to think and to dream. Today, most of us, most people in the world today in the early 21st century, we speak, we think, we dream in imperial languages that were forced upon our ancestors by the sword, by conquest. Most people today in East Asia, in China, they speak and dream in the language of the Han Empire, Han Chinese. Similarly, in America, no matter what the origins of the people is, nearly all the inhabitants of the two continents of America, from Alaska in the north to the Straits of Magellan in the south, almost all people communicate in one out of just 4 imperial languages. Either they use English, French, Spanish, or Portuguese. Similarly, in the Middle East, if you go, say, to Egypt, present-day Egyptians, they speak Arabic. They think about themselves as Arab. If you ask an Egyptian who he is, he says, I'm Arab. And the Egyptians identify with the Arab Empire. But this Arab Empire, it conquered Egypt by brute force in the 7th century, and then crushed with an iron fist the repeated revolts that broke against its rule in Egypt. Egyptians today are the descendants of people conquered by the Arabs. They didn't speak Arab, and they didn't see themselves as Arab, but now they do speak Arab. They do speak Arabic, and they do think about themselves as being Arab. Similarly, in South Africa, there are today about 10 million people in South Africa that call themselves Zulu and that use the Zulu language and miss the age of glory of the Zulu nation in the early 19th century. But most of these 10 million Zulus descend from tribes who fought against the Zulu Empire in the early 19th century and were conquered by the Zulu and incorporated into the Zulu Empire through bloody military campaigns. And yet their descendants today think about themselves as being Zulu. Take even this course. I'm talking to you in English, even though, as you probably noticed, English is not my mother tongue. And also, it's very probable that English is not the native tongue of many of you. Even those of you who live in the United States or Canada or Australia, you probably descend from ancestors who did not speak English and who were forced to start speaking English by their British overlords. The reason that I'm using English to conduct this course, and that all courses in this university, Coursera, are conducted in English, is simply that English was the language of the biggest empire in history, the British Empire. So it's no coincidence that I'm telling you the history of the world in English, in the language of the biggest empire of history. So empires, we see, they do work, at least sometimes, and they have leave behind them not only an evil legacy of death and destruction, but also very important and probably positive legacies of art and culture and languages and worldviews and so forth. What we'll try to do in the next segment of this lesson is understand how the idea of empire first emerged and how empires started from very, very small places in the world and eventually conquered almost the whole of planet Earth.